Willkommen in einem anderen aufregendes video, or welcome to another exciting video. In this case, it's my second example game of Neu-Schwerpunkt version 1 rules. Neu-Schwerpunkt is based on the SPI Modern Battle series of board games published by SPI back in the 1970s. This video uses a figure game version of these rules. This is not going to be a rules-focused video. Instead, it will provide an overview of what a standard scenario looks like, or at least what the gameplay is. Now, I'll be using a rather unusual playing area, which happens to be a playing area I created for Napoleonics Rules, and which did actually cause some minor issues, but nonetheless the game was reasonably robust and worked reasonably well. As with my other example video, I'm not going to make any attempt to describe the SPI board game. The only significant points I wanted to raise is its scale. Each unit, for the most part, represents a battalion, with the width of each unit being about 1800 metres. Each game turn represents a full day, 12 hours if using modern warfare, and 24 hours for World War II, which is the scale that I use in this example video. This example game takes place, well, it should take place over 12 days, although I'll only be covering the first 5 days of action in this video. Gameplay took about 20 minutes per game turn, with 6 game turns taking about 180 minutes to play. The game turn ended on game turn 6 because we discovered the amount of terrain unbalanced the scenario, which you'll see later in this video. But nonetheless, you could play a full 12 game turn game well within half a day period using these rules. I'm actually coming to think that 12 game turns is probably a bit long for this game system, and 8 is probably a more optimum length, something I may do some additional investigation with further playtesting. The game is played on a 3x4 foot playing area. In this case, I'll be using a playing area which was originally designed for Napoleonics. The actual playing area is the area around Leipzig and represents some rather difficult terrain for the attackers. In most cases, my scenarios do not have such a large double river running through the centre of the playing area, and I discovered it did have a rather major impact on the scenario compared with my other test games. This shows the playing area set up with 15mm Napoleonics terrain features. I did not take a photo, unfortunately, of the terrain using my 6mm terrain features, which do differ a bit, particularly the built-up area. Unfortunately, it was an error on my part, but nonetheless you get a view of what the playing area looks like and how difficult the centre of the playing area is in terms of terrain. The scenario I used was a 200-point attacking force arriving on the playing area on game turn 1 and a 100% defender on the playing area on game 2, or before the game begins. The defender gets 50 points of forces on game turn 3 and 100 points on game turn 6. Plays along the long axis of the playing area. The force mixes which I used are shown on the right. You'll also see the attacker force mix schedule chart. In my rules, I generally determine what the force mix is randomly. The attacker spins a dice, the defender spins a dice, you get a matrix of points. It's a fairly simple point system, so you can quickly whip together the forces that you so desire. The scenario sheet contains the total points for each division, so you basically go through, pick the divisions you want, and then add air forces or air support and corps level or army level for the Soviets, in order to round your point mix up to the required 50, 100 or 150 or 200. In the game, the German starts with 2 divisions, an infantry and a Panzergrenadier division. This shows the infantry division, 6 infantry battalions, 1 Rek battalion, a anti-tank battalion, 3 10.5cm battalions and 1 15cm battalion. The artillery is all horse-towed. The Panzergrenadier division consists of 6 motorised infantry battalions, an armoured car battalion, an assault gun battalion, a Panzerjäger battalion, 2 10.5cm battalions and a 15cm battalion. The artillery is all truck-towed. The Germans received 2 Panzer divisions and a Panzergrenadier division as reinforcements. This shows the Panzer division, 2 Panzer battalions, 3 motorised battalions, 1 half-track battalion, a Panzerjäger battalion, armoured car battalion, a SP howitzer battalion, a 10.5cm battalion and a 15cm battalion. The Germans have some air support and some minimal corps level support, mainly Panzerjäger battalions. Now, just a quick note, the period that this battle was supposed to be fought is approximately the middle of 1944, which is why the army-less force mixes are the way you see them here. The Russian forces consist of 3 tank corps. This consists of 3 tank brigades, not battalions, but brigades, because the Soviet brigades consisted at this particular point in time of about 60 tanks, which makes them a battalion size. 6 motorised infantry battalions, tank destroyer battalion, an assault gun battalion, a rocket artillery battalion, and 2 76.2mm battalions, specifically designed for indirect fire, although they can actually be used in anti-tank role, although that is not going to be the case in the first half of the game, which is what you'll be seeing. The Russian also has some army-level formations, mainly some 152mm howitzer battalions and air support. One of the big issues with the Russians in my playtesting is they really do not have much indirect fire, and indirect fire is actually quite important in this game, so I always load up some Army level 152 motorised howitzer battalions with any of my Russian force mixes to give it a little bit more punch. Now, I know this is probably not particularly historically accurate. The tank corps, once they've broken through, generally left all the artillery or most of it behind. But anyway, that's what I do for play balance purpose. This shows the playing area again, with the arrows on the left representing the entry points of the 3 Russian tank corps, and the line that you see down the centre representing the German defensive line. Now, the Germans could have defended anywhere. They could have defended on the Ford River if they wished, but quite wisely they decided to defend there. In retrospect, I think I probably would have been better off defending with the Ford River, or at least some minimal defence there. But nonetheless, I think the Germans did the correct decision in terms of maximising the defensive terrain. The circles represent the standard victory points that I use in my scenarios. Only the attacker counts victory points, 1 VP per objective when it's first occupied, and 1 VP for each objective held at the end of the game. As you can see, most of the fighting was going to be focused on the major town in the centre, mainly a combination of terrain, because it's really hard to get over, and the fact that that's what the Russian needs to even have a hope for a draw. This shows the German front line with their forces deployed. Wisely, the Germans decided to defend the river rather than stay out in the open. The red line shows the German movement zone of control, or front line. 2 divisions can easily defend a width of about 3 feet. It's not a very dense defence, and actually later in this video I'll be talking about some historical scenarios where normally the density in a fixed defence, that is a prepared defence, is significantly higher than what you see here. But anyway, the objective here is to reflect a Russian breakthrough. The breakthrough has already occurred and the Germans have thrown up a force to stop the Russians and then counterattack. That's kind of the scenario which I tend to feel is most interesting. But if you want to do a set-piece battle, like for example one of the Kursk battles, or maybe the Korsun, or the Russian attempt to create the pocket at Korsun, unit density is significantly higher than what you see here. This is the first of the same front line, but this time it shows a top-down view. As you can see, there's a lot of terrain for the Russians to get through. This ended up being a major issue for the final result of the game. The main objective, as I indicated before, is in the centre of the view, which is the main town. Now, the Russians could have made a big push on the right flank to try and grab that objective instead of the main town in the middle, but as we'll discover later, the lack of roads and the difficult terrain would have really delayed the Russian engagement with the Germans, and I think that would have been a mistake. So really, the only chance the Russians had was to take that centre town initially, and then hopefully try and break out from that position. Now, the Germans could have tried to hold the objective town further towards the Russian front line, but I suspect that would have been a disaster for the Germans, so they wisely decided to pull back and just defend the centre objective. As we saw earlier, the German player had deployed the initial start forces, which consists of 1 infantry division and 1 Panzergrenadier division. The Russian player now comes onto the playing area in 3 columns, 1 column per tank corps, and the army assets at the end of any of the 3 columns. This shows the 3 columns at the end of the Russian movement phase. 2 of the columns are taking advantage of the roads, and the 3rd is travelling across country. The tracked units can move faster, so they manage to engage on game turn 1. The only combat on game turn 1 is on the Russian left flank, and that consists of the tank units that you see here and the Russian air support, of which there is 5. The Germans throw all their air assets into defence, as well as artillery FPF fire. Let's drill down into combat in more detail. The Russians attack with only 2 tank units, because the third one's not actually within the combat zone of control, and they also use their 5 air support points. Total attack strength is 13. The Germans defend at 2 with 2 defensive FPF points and 2 air support points, and their defensive total is 6. The differential is +5. There is a 2 shift because the defenders are in a built-up area. The result is D2 because they spin a 2. The defenders retreat 2 base widths, and the Russians advance after combat only 1 base width. I actually made an error here. When tanks, unsupported by infantry, attack infantry in a built-up area, they're halved in strength. But regardless, that result would have been a D1, and actually the Russians only advanced 1 anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. That ends the Russian player turn. Now we come to the German player turn. The German player does some minimal manoeuvring around, but the big issue that they have is that the Russians have moved a tank unit within the movement zone control of some artillery, so they have to counterattack. Well, actually they're forced to attack, and they really want to get that tank unit out of there. Unfortunately for the Germans, the tank unit is not surrounded. That is, it can actually retreat, so they can't eliminate it. Anyway, the Germans attack with a total strength of 10 against 7 with a differential of +3. The Germans spin a 2, and the result is D2. The Russian tank unit must retreat 2 base widths. The Germans only advance 1 base width into the area that they occupied before. At the end of game turn 1, this is the front line in the area where we had combat. As you can see, not much has changed. We now move into game turn 2. There are no reinforcements during this game turn. During the Russian movement phase, they continue to move up their tank corps and launch an attack across the entire front line, as you can see here. The main objective, of course, is the main town. Starting at the Russian right end, the Russians attack with 5 against 2, differential +3, shift 2, back to 0, that's differential 0. They spin a 6, which is an A1. The Russians retreat 1 base width. Because of the way the Germans have defended, that is, there is a 1 base width gap between each element, there's no chance of attacking in such a way that surrounds a unit to eliminate it. So as a result, the attack order is not particularly that important, except to soak off the German artillery support and air support. That is why the Russians started with the extreme right flank, hoping the Germans would allocate air support there or artillery. They didn't. So now their 2 main attacks will basically face the entire strength of the German Air Force and German artillery support. So let's start with the first main attack. The Russians attack with 13 against 5. Differential is +8. There is a shift of 2. They spin a 5, which is a both retreat result, which means both sides retreat 1 base width. Not very good for the Russians. Now we move into the next main attack, and the numbers are identical. The Russians attack with 13, the Germans defend with 5. It's a differential of +8. The Russians spin a 2, there is a shift 2, the result is D1. This is a better result for the Russians. On the left flank, the attacks aren't quite so important, but still reasonably significant. If the Russians can manage to break through here, they can outflank the town, and it becomes much easier to take and hold. So anyway, they launch an attack here. They attack with 7 against 3, differential +4. They have a shift 2 and spin a 1. The result is D2. This is a good result. For the previous attack, the Russians decided to only advance 1 unit 1 base width. They could have actually moved 2 base width and followed the Germans all the way back. Anyway, the next attack, the Russians attack with 10 versus 2, differential +8. They spin a 5, which is a D1. Another reasonably good result. We move to the next attack. The Russians attack with 5 against 3. Differential is 2. Shift 2, spin a 2. The result is D1. Now, I actually made an error here and applied a result of A1. I'm uncertain why I did this. I must have just misread the CRT. Now we move to the German movement phase. The Germans readjust their front line and launch a number of counterattacks. Now, of course, if they remain in the Russian movement zone of control, they're forced to attack. That's simply the game system. but they also decide to launch a couple of counterattacks to try and force the Russians back out of the town and re-secure their front line. What we see here is the main attack. Now, the reason why it's so important is that you cannot retreat across the river. You can retreat across a stream, but you can't retreat across a river. So if the Germans manage to cause this unit to retreat, it is eliminated. Anyway, the Germans attack with 12 against 9. You'll notice that the Russians have thrown every single bit of air support they have, as well as every single bit of indirect fire support within range in an attempt to defend this unit. The Germans, unfortunately for the Russians, spin a 2 and get a D2. The Russian unit must retreat, but it cannot retreat across the river and is instead eliminated. The Germans have re-secured the town. For the second German attack, they attack with 4 against 4. Spin a 5, the result is A1. The Germans quite correctly decided that the bulk of their forces should have been allocated towards the tank unit, which had gone into the main town, rather than this particular front position. If they'd just managed to throw a bit more stuff in here, actually if they threw in more stuff they still would have retreated, but anyway, they get an A1, which is not so good for the Germans. And so what we see here is the final position at the end of game turn 2. As you can see, the Russians are getting or making some progress on their left flank in an attempt to outflank the town. We now have game turn 3, which is when the first German reinforcements arrive, which is not good news for the Russians because they really, well, you would have expected them to be able to take the town fully by the end of game turn 3, and that's going to be a big ask for them. During the Russian movement phase, they continue to move units up and decide to launch another mass attack from edge to edge, expanding their attack along their right flank. We'll start with the extreme Russian right flank, which is the third corps, which has taken a long time to get engaged with the Germans because there's no road and the terrain is absolutely awful. Anyway, the Russians just managed to get in contact with the Germans, and they decide to launch an attack with their 2 tank units, which have an attack value of 8, against the German defenders 3, which is 2 for the armoured car and 1 support. Differentials +5. There is a 2 shift because they're attacking across the stream, or river actually, and the Russians spin a 6, which is an A1. Not too good. Moving along the front line, the next attack is close to the centre. In this case, the Russians attack with 10 versus 2, differential +8. There is 2 shifts. They spin a 2 and the result is D2. After getting the D2, the Russians decide to advance the full depth of 2 base widths. Now, when you advance after combat, you can only advance after combat with 1 unit. So it's a bit isolated, but it's pretty important that the Russians establish a toehold on the other side of the river. Okay, for the next attack, they attack with 5 versus 4, differential +1. There is 2 shifts. They spin a 3 and the result is A1. Not so good. Launching the second attack against the key town, they attack with 8 versus 2. There is 2 shifts. Spin a 6 and it's a BR, also not so good, as both sides retreat 1 base width. When you're the non-phasing player and you retreat in a BR situation, it's not bad because you get the next movement phase and you can move back in, which is exactly what the Germans will do. Incidentally, as I indicated before, when the armour attacks infantry in a built-up area, its attack strength is halved. Again, I made another error here. When I say error, I didn't make an error in my interpretation of the rules. I realised what the rules would be like, but I should have actually had an infantry unit with the army unit rather than 2 army units attacking the German defenders. We'll now move to the deep penetration on the Russian left flank. Now, the Russian infantry unit had advanced 2 base widths in to try and take as much territory. Unfortunately, it's facing a lot of units, and so it needs to attack all of the units, or at least all the German units have to be attacked by something. So anyway, the infantry now launch their attack. They attack with 6 because the Russians have thrown all their air power here. The Germans throw all their air power in again, so it's 6 versus 5 +1. There is no shift, and the Germans or the Russians spin a 4, which means it's a both retreat. Not good for the Russians. Now, the Russian artillery was out of range, so could not support this attack. It's one of the issues with 76mm indirect fire. The range isn't particularly great. Now, the Russians launched this attack because if the attacks on either flank failed, and there are some more attacks, this unit would be surrounded and thus could not retreat. In this position that you see here, it's just not surrounded, so if it was forced to retreat, which is exactly what occurred, it's not eliminated. That is, the distance between the German units on either flank is just greater than 6 centimetres, which means it can move through a gap where you're just outside of movement zone control on either edge. So there is a retreat path. Now, the only problem with launching this attack first is it will displace the Russian units to its rear. And as one is artillery, this cannot conduct bombardment of this combat phase. It also moves a unit out of combat range, so it cannot attack. So there are some downsides. In retrospect, possibly the attack, one of the flank attacks should have been instigated. So when the centre one force was forced to retreat, it would just simply displace units that had already been involved in combat. But anyway, it's easy to determine correct strategy when you view the photos several hours after the game, or several days anyway. Now we launch the possibly more critical flank attack, starting with the attack on the right of this little area here. The Russians attack with 8 against 2, there is 2 shifts, and they spin a 4, which is a D1, good result. The next attack on this specific area is caused by the fact the Russians have to attack. They attack with 1 versus 2, there is a 2 shift, they spin a 3, and they get the expected A1. There was pretty much no other result possible. Now we move to the left side of this particular area of the front line. The Russians attack with 2 versus 2, there's a shift 2, they spin a 1, and it's a BR, which is well, actually, it's irrelevant. It's not a good or a bad result, it's the expected result. As we move along this particular sector, the next Russian attack is 3 versus 2. There is a 2 shift because they're attacking across the stream. They spin a 6 and the result is an A1, not a particularly good result. And at the extreme left of the Russian flank, the Russians attack with 3 versus 2. There is 2 shifts because the defender are in woods, and the Russians spin a 4. The result is A1. This shows the position at the end of the Russian player turn. Now we move to the German player turn. During game turn 3, the Germans receive a panzer division as reinforcements, which arrives in a column from the German player edge along the road. Generally, it can't get into contact on this particular game turn, but it will certainly be involved in the next game turn. It was obvious that the Russians had not advanced sufficiently in this scenario, mainly due to the difficult terrain. Even without the German reinforcements, the Russian job would have been rather difficult to take the town. Starting with the compulsory attacks, because there are enemy units in the movement zones controls of each other, or opposing enemy units, the Germans counterattack with 14 against 7, because this is a pretty important attack. It's a shift 2 because the Russian defenders are on a town, and the Germans spin a 4, which results in D1. The Russian unit is pushed back. On the other side of the town, the Germans launch another counterattack, in this case 4 versus 2. They unfortunately spin a 5, which is a both retreat. This is not good for the Germans because basically the Russians can actually expand their bridgehead as a result of this. This shows the front line at the end of the German player turn and at the end of game turn 3. Remember, the Russians move first in game turn 4, so even though there are no Russian units in that salient that you can see here, the Russians will be able to easily move straight in there, which is exactly what they do in game turn 4. We now move into game turn 4. There are no reinforcements during this game turn. Game turn 4, the Russians conduct their movement, and this shows the position after the completion of the Russian movement phase. As you can see, the Russians really have poured stuff into that salient on the left, although they haven't quite been able to pour enough stuff into the salient on the right, as you can see. Starting once again on the extreme right wing, we start the attack against that damn German armoured car unit. In this case, the Russians attack with 6 versus 2, differential +4. There is a shift 2. The Russians spin a 3, which is a D1. Hurrah for the Russians. Moving up the front line, we look at the next attack. In this case, it's an 8 versus 3, differential 5. There's a shift 2, once again because of the river, and we spin, or the Russians spin A3. The result is a D1, another reasonably good result for the Russians. In the next attack, the Russians attack with 5 against 3 with 2 shifts because of the river once again, and they spin a 2, resulting in a d1. The Russians are spinning well on this particular front line. Now we come to possibly a more critical part of the front line, which is the bulge on the right of the town. The Russians attack with 7 against 3 and a shift of 2 because of a town, and they spin a 2. The result is d1. The Russians take this town, which is reasonably important for the Russians. On the other side of the salient, the Russians attack with 1 against 2, and with a shift 2, they spin a 5, the result being an expected a1. Now we come to another mass Russian assault against the town. The Russians attack with 16 against 5. As you can see, there's lots of German air power involved in this attack and a hell of a lot of Russian indirect fire, because by now all of it's within range. There's a shift 2 because of the town. The Russians spin a 6, which is not a good result for the Russians, and the result is a BR. Incidentally, I forgot to mention on the last slide, BR represent both retreat. Both sides have to retreat 1 base width, and as you can see, the town is cleared, but as the next movement phase is German, the Germans will simply be able to move straight back in again, so it's not so good for the Russians. The Russians once again attack with 8 against 3, and once again I forgot about the halving when you've only got armour, but anyway, it is what it is. There's a shift 2, the Russians spin a 2, the result is d1, the Russians are back in the town. The Russians decided to advance after combat, even though last time they did this they lost their unit. In this particular case they've got the German unit surrounded, and the Russians decide to launch a major attack against this surrounded German infantry battalion. They attack with 12 against 5, 5 of which is aircraft against 2. There's a shift 2 and they spin a 6. The result is a BR. Now, even though that's not so hot for the Russians, in a BR, or both retreat, the defenders always retreat first. The German battalion cannot retreat, so is eliminated. Then the Russians have to retreat, which is not so good for the Russians. Still in the salient, on the left of the town, the Russians attack with 4 against 3, differential of +1. There is no shift, and they spin a 4. The result is a both retreat. Both sides have to retreat 1 base width. As you can see here, there's going to be a bit of displacement of units. During the retreat, the unit ends up displacing other units that were about to attack, thus moving them outside of the attack range, which is not particularly great, but not a major issue. For the next important attack, the Russians attack with 10 against 2. There is a shift 2 because of the town, not because of the river, because there's 1 unit still across the river that's attacking, thus negating the stream. I should say stream, not river. Unfortunately, the Russians spin a 6, which is a both retreat. Both sides have to retreat 1 base width, which is not really good. The Russians are not spinning particularly well on this flank. As we continue along this flank, the Russians attack with 6 versus 2, differential of +4. There is a shift 2 because of the stream, and the Russians spin their favourite number, which happens to be a 6. The result is an A1. Now, once again, the Russian unit has to displace a unit behind it, so it decides to displace a unit which has already retreated rather than the unit yet to attack, which is directly to its rear. The Russians launch their final attack, 4 against 2. There's a shift of 2 because of the woods, and a 6 is spun, resulting in an A1. The Russians have managed to spin 3 6s out of 4 rolls. Pretty amazing luck, or bad luck. The dice gods are not favouring the evil communist hordes. This shows the final position at the end of the 4th day, or 4th game turn, or at least the 4th day of the Russian player turn, and their offensive. Now we come to the German counterattack. The Germans start launching their counterattacks. Starting on the Russian extreme right flank, or the German left flank, they decide to try and force the Russians back across the river. They attack with 5 versus 2, spin a 1, and the result is a D2. Now, because there is a bridge behind that unit, even though it's a river, the unit can retreat across the bridge. If there was no bridge there, the Russian unit would be eliminated. The next counterattack to try and force the Russians back, and if they succeed here, they actually eliminate the Russian unit. Anyway, they attack with 3 versus 3, differential is 0, there is no shifting, and they spin a 5. Result is A1, they fail. It's probably expected, the differential is not particularly high here. Next attack, the Germans attack with 3 versus 2 and spin a 3. The result is D1. Now I made an error here. The Russian unit actually is on the other side of the river, and technically it should not be able to retreat across the river and should be eliminated. I didn't eliminate it. I think the reason why was because I did not realise that it was actually across the river. The reason why it's across the river is that you'll notice the front edge is on the opposing side and the other edge is not on the other edge. So as a result, it must be on the other side of the river. We now move along the front line. In this case, the Germans attack with 3 versus 2, shift 2, and they spin a 2, which is a both retreat. Not so great for the Germans. We'll now launch 2 attacks in a single slide here. The Germans attack with 6 versus 2, spin a 5, which is a BR, and then the next attack, which is 4 versus 2, differential of 2, and spin a 6, which is also a BR. Not too good for the Germans. Now the retreat's interesting here. There should have been more Russian units eliminated, which I forgot about. Once again, in the heat of battle, I forgot that you can't retreat across the river. Now we come to the main attack. The Russians need to defend this location at all costs and throw everything they can in it. So, the Germans also need to remove this unit, throw everything they have it. The Germans attack with 18 versus 11, differential of 7, shift 2. The Germans spin a4, which is a D1. The Russian unit is eliminated. I did remember the rule here because it's so important. You can see how difficult it is to get across the river, because even if you actually get across the river, the counterattack can destroy your units, and that's not a really good thing. Anyway, as we move along, the Germans continue their counterattack. They launch an attack 1 versus 2, -1. They have a shift of 2, spin a 4. The result is expected A1. So at least the Russians have managed to get that little corner position back. This shows the front line at the end of game turn 4. The Russian salient on the right of the town has grown, which is good for the Russians, but unfortunately the salient on the left has been contracted, which is not so good. We now move to game turn 5. There are no reinforcements on this game turn. Now, I'm not going to be providing a blow-by-blow account of this, as the Russian advance had basically stalled, mainly due to the terrain, I think. In desperation, the Russian player decides to use the active CRT, which causes a lot more casualty in an attempt to break through. This did not work, and perhaps the Russians should have used this CRT on game turn 3 and game turn 4 instead, but it certainly did help the Russians advance significantly more than they had previously. Just a quick note, the players, or either player, has the option of selecting the mobile CRT, which is the default CRT, which they can use at any time, and something called the active CRT, which is a CRT that they can use which causes more casualties on both sides. Now obviously if you're the attacker and you have more units, causing casualties on both sides is a much better thing, and as a result the active CRT is what you would normally use when you get stuck. Now both players have the option of using the active CRT for a maximum of 2 game turns out of the entire game. This comes from the original SBI board game, incidentally. What the Russians should have done in retrospect is started using this CRT from game turn 3, accepted more casualties but inflicted more casualties before the German reinforcements that arrived. Anyway, water under the bridge. This shows the position at the end of game turn 5. The Russian attack during this game turn had caused massive casualties among the Russians, and also some casualties against the Germans, but not as much as the Russians, but had more importantly allowed the Russians to take the entire town, as well as establish a significant toehold on the other side. So even if they're forced to retreat, there's a bit of room behind them. Now the problem is on game turn 6, the Germans receive a Panzer Division and Panzer Grenadier Division, which makes the Germans the attacker. From a victory points of view, control of the central time at any central town at any time gives the Russians 1 VP, and they also get an additional 2 VPs for the entry town, which is on the Russian side, and another objective town behind the Russian front line under their control. Now, if the Russians manage to retain control of the town on game turn 12, which is very unlikely, they could get another 3 VPs from the 3 objectives they hold. This will achieve a draw. But the more likely result is they would lose control of the bulk of the town, or the town, and only gain 2 VPs, which means that they achieve a marginal loss. Strangely enough, the terrain would actually make it hard for the Germans to drive the Russians back further and achieve a German substantive win or a Russian substantive loss. So, the terrain is a bit of a two-edged thing. Now, on game turn, I think 6 from memory, the Russians had lost 9 units, the Germans had lost 3 units. Losses from this point on were minimal because the Germans never got to a position where they decided to take on the active CRT. We kind of just fudged the last couple of game turns, only really played it up until game turn 8. The Germans would have used the active CRT on game turn 9 or the last 2 game turns in a desperate attempt to try and take an objective, but I don't think they were nowhere near it, so there was no chance of that occurring. So this is pretty much the casualties, plus maybe a couple of units on both sides for the entire game. Now, the interesting thing here is that the total casualties at this point represents losses of about 20% for the Russians, so fairly high losses, but not over the top. In my conclusion of this playtest, which is probably my most extensive playtest of this standard scenario so far, the terrain had a significant impact on the flow of play. The double river running through the playing area slowed the Russian attack and also limited the German counterattack. In most of my test games using this type of scenario, the terrain is not so severe. As a result, you get a lot more mobility. That is, the attackers drive much further into the enemy front line and even have a chance of taking the objective point that's on the opposing side half of the playing area, and the counterattack moves the front line further in the other direction. This double river really created a very static front line, which is a little bit unusual for this game system. Now, my other observation after this game was the front line was really messy. A combination of terrain and the high element density may play a little bit confusing. I suppose my built-up areas may have contributed to this a bit, but I've never actually seen such a messy front line in any of my test games. Again, I think this is the result of having such a static front line. However, even though the unit density in this game is a bit unusually high compared to most of my other test games, compared with historical set-piece battles, this is actually a rather low density. In my investigation of scenarios, I quickly discovered if I tried to reproduce a set-piece battle, I needed to scale the units up to regiment scale. This actually works, and works quite well, with an infantry division consisting of 2 infantry regiments units and an artillery regiment unit with maybe a supporting regiment consisting of all the other battalions combined. I could change the ground scale from 1 in 60,000 to 1 in 30,000, which also works, but then the other scenarios do not work because you don't have enough units to cover the front line. There's too many gaps. After I observed this, I went back to the original SPI board game. I discovered the World War II games used wildly different ground scales, ranging from 1 in 15,000 up to 1 in 80,000 ground scales, if you convert it to a figure gaming format, in order to fit the battlefield onto their standard size maps. And again, for figure gaming it's much the same. I have a standard size figure gaming playing area, and also to achieve the correct unit ratio. In some of the battles you had a lot of units all rammed together, in other battles you had much lesser units. In the modern battles quad, where the ground scale was more consistent, SPI varied the unit scale instead. So we saw battalions, regiments, or even brigades in a game. So, SPI actually used both these 2 strategies to overcome this unit density type of issue that I've just sort of uncovered. And we can do the same thing in the figure gaming world, or figure gaming game that you see here. Now, I must point out this scale issue, that is, some battles have so many units that you end up with a traffic jam, and some battles have so few units you can't cover your front line. This issue only really exists when you're trying to reproduce a historical battle. When using standard points-based games, there's no real issue, but I did create this game system to both refight points-based games as well as historical games. So working out how to refight historical battles, such as the Southern Soviet pincher attack at Korsun or the Northern German attack towards Kursk, I needed a way to allow me to field units on the playing area that was both historical and with a reasonable density. Let's look at an example of the German northern attack at Kursk. The playing area is at 1/60,000 ground scale, so it represents a playing area of 3 by 4 feet. If you look at the 258th Infantry Division, the German, which consists of 2 infantry regiments, you can see what I mean. This division is covering a front line which is about 15 centimetres long on a figure gaming playing area, if this was a 3 by 4. Assuming each element consists, or regiment consists of 3 infantry battalions, this unit could actually cover 18 centimetres with no gaps between elements. Thus, one unit would need to be in the rear along with any of the supporting battalions, anti-tank battalions and wreck battalions, and the game system doesn't really encourage this. Deploying this force mix would result in a lot of units in the rear not being involved in any combat over, let's say, a 24-hour period. Also, this unit density would result in a very static game, which may actually be historical, so that's not a particular issue. The issue is that the game system does not encourage you to have units to the rear. It really does encourage you to have everything in the front line contributing to attack and defence, and you simply can't do that with this number of units. You can see the same thing in several other battles. If we look at the southern attack at Korsun, that is the southern thrust, which was the main thrust, the Russians deployed 2 tank corps and 4 infantry corps across a frontage of 4 feet. The scale, once again, 1/60,000. What you see here is the width of a 4-foot playing area. Now, or 3-foot playing area, I should say, because in this game the Russians do drive quite deeply. Now, this is equally a very high density. Now, the German density is not so good. The Germans start with 2 infantry divisions covering basically 90 centimetres. That's probably okay. But then they throw 3 to 4 panzer divisions in to reinforce them. Even at that density, not so bad. But the Russians' density is just incredibly high, and there'll be a lot of units in the rear twiddling their thumbs in this particular game. It's not insurmountable. It's not a major problem. You can still play the game as it exists. But you have a very high density, and it's just, not as nice to play, so to speak. More a playability issue than a historical issue. Now, in the modern battles campaigns, SPI often combine battalions to form regiments, especially in the infantry divisions. Now, this would reduce the number of units dramatically and allow players to reproduce a historical conflict using a more reasonable number of units. I should note that SPI seem to combine the attack and defence strengths of all the sub-units, the battalion-sized units, with a -1 modifier. So in this case, the infantry regiment would be using the modern battle system 254, which may be more appropriate, but I think if I did this, and I certainly will experiment with it, I would basically combine the 3 battalions together, add all the values straight, and end up with a single battalion. Now, in the Korsun example, I would not be doing this because 2 infantry divisions would be needed to cover the entire front line. But at Kursk, I would absolutely do this because then my 256th Infantry Division, which is supposed to cover 15 centimetres, now consists of basically 2 units, and 2 units can cover 15 centimetres with gaps in between. I need to do a bit more play testing, I suspect, in order to flesh this out, but the point being is that if you're going to try and reproduce a historical set-piece battle, you will probably end up needing to combine the battalions into regiment-size formations. Now, I actually already do this with the tank corps because the tank brigades, the units actually represent brigades rather than battalions. Now, the reason for that is that Russian battalions were rather small. At this point in time, during the war, they consisted typically of about 20 tanks. So 3 of them is 60, that gives you a unit. But you could also do that in order to reduce your unit count to give you a better game. Basically, this game system works better if you don't have a line of units from edge to edge all in contact with each other. It works. It just works a lot better when there are gaps. Now, there is another option, and that is you could allow units in the rear to support units in the front in attack or defence. And this is actually an optional rule and is based on my stacking concept, which I created from the Napoleonic rules, which I tend not to generally use in the World War II or Modern Battles rules. Now, this would actually resolve some issues, because basically then you would have an infantry battalion in the front line, and then probably you would have an anti-tank battalion directly in the rear of it in base-to-base contact, and they would both basically form a single unit for defence. Or if an attack, again, the same sort of system, and that would work, but I tend to prefer less units on the playing area rather than more. So I suspect the combining unit system would be preferred as far as I'm concerned if I wanted to reproduce a historical battle. Look, overall, the game plays reasonably well. Unlike a board game, opposing players will need to be rather accommodating. As you can see in this example video, the position of some elements and how close they are to each other could easily be the subject of a dispute. I wonder if a better system would involve elements touching each other, but then the game system will need to dramatically change, and I've already have a set of rules which provide a more robust experience in this area, even if it's more complex. I don't really want to design a new set of rules. There are too many rules as it is. I just want to take the SPI game system and try and make it work for figure gaming, and I think basically I've achieved it in this particular set of rules here with minimal numbers of modifications. So in conclusion, considering my intention was never to write any kind of new set of rules from scratch, that's just simply too much work. By reproducing the SPI set of rules as closely as possible, I think I've achieved a reasonable game experience with these particular rules. But I will be investigating some other ideas to make gameplay a little bit easier. Now, one idea that I have been thinking about, and which I'll probably do some work on, and that will be almost certainly in the next video, is using a big base version of the rules, and that would reduce the number of units dramatically and be a lot easier to deal with unit position issues which can occur with the standard base version. In this example game, each side commanded about 50 units, 50 elements, and that can result in some crowding. A big base set of rules would reduce this unit count to 12 or 24 maximum per size, and with larger bases, 6 centimetres square being what I normally use, the determination of movements under control would be easier. Now, when I say the existing set of rules, that is the example you're seeing here, is a bit confusing. Most of the confusion is that it's just fiddly, okay, the movement of units and things of this nature. If you didn't have so much fiddliness, there would be no issue. For example, if this was actually a board game where you had a flat map and the counters were, big pieces of cardboard that you moved around, you didn't have to worry about terrain and stuff like that, then it would probably be a bit of a cleaner game. But the other way would be to actually increase the base size. I noticed with my Napoleonics conversion, I don't have anywhere near the same issues as I had here. Not that they're great issues, but nonetheless I don't have as many issues. And I think part of the reason is that the element width there is 4 centimetres. So if you increase width, you end up dealing with less units, so to speak, and it's easier to determine their position and where they fit in, relation with other units. Now, by reducing the number of units, the scenarios may not be as exciting, but certainly would be a lot simpler and a lot more playable if you're engaging in a more competitive style of game. Now, on an unrelated topic, this was my first game using my newly based 6mm figures. The bases use two-tone woodland fine turf, with the Germans a different colour pattern to the Russians. I originally was fearful the Russian or the figures would get lost in this, but I must admit they are clearly visible, so I don't think that's really an issue. The elements do match my playing area, as everything uses woodland fine turf, which is good, but the figures are nonetheless quite visible. I decided to use different colour patterns between the two sides so you could identify them, and I think this works rather well. My Napoleonic figures all use the same pattern, and it was hard to tell the difference between sides sometimes. Here I had minimal issues. While rebasing my figures, I tried some interesting new experiments. I decided to put the toe, that is either horse or vehicle, on the artillery bases. So this depicts whether or not the artillery is truck-towed or horse-drawn towed. This is the only set of rules which really cares about this, but I do like the diorama effect. It also allows me to use all the toes that I've purchased. It's, for example, not really common to ever see an SDK of set 10 in a typical figure game. So I finally get some use out of these figures that I've purchased. My only issue is that it's surprisingly hard to purchase simple horse figures. The only real aspect of the rules which may cause some players issue is just how few tanks you ever get to field. While most forces will be motorised, so you obviously get lots of trucks or possibly a few half-tracks, there are very few tanks actually on the playing area. A Panzer division gets 2 tank figures, a Russian tank corps gets 3 tank figures. Now, each of these formations do typically have a tank destroyer and assault gun element as well, so you do get a few more AFVs, but it's still a very low number. Another observation or possible issue is that you don't really get to use your AA weapons. While you could create optional rules which allows you to field AA, it serves no real purpose in the game system, and I quickly dropped the idea. After all, adding something just for the sake of you being able to use your 88 elements or your 85mm anti-aircraft elements doesn't really make sense at this particular scale. Maybe I'll rethink it later and maybe add it as optional rules, but I just don't think it's worth it. And so we come to an end of my part 2 example of play for Neu-Schwerpunkt Rules version 1. The rules can be downloaded from the IO group Schwerpunkt site. My current conclusion is the rules work rather well. They give you a good game and in a very short period of time with a clear result, and allows you to use all those figures which you sweated blood painting. Unfortunately, it means you don't get to use a lot of AA figures, which is a bit of a negative, but at least all those trucks get placed on the playing area and get used. Denken Sie daran, immer viel zu kämpfen.